Oscar De La Hoya has expressed his disappointment. He feels offended by the fact that Turki Al-Sheikh has teamed up with Dana White, and he's come out with a bunch of comments about, destroying all the other promoters, so on and so forth. De La Hoya says he felt a little offended. So we read, I hear that Turki passed over the reins of boxing to Dana White. That comment to me, I felt a little offended. I've been in boxing all my life. I've been promoting for 20 some odd years. So what I want to do is stay in my lane and do what I do for Golden Boy and DAZN and give the fans the best fights that can possibly be made, just like we've been doing for years. Working with Turki Al-Sheikh and Riyadh Season and sprinkling these big championship events, it's an honor for me to do that. But I have my business that I'm going to take care of as well. And nobody's going to touch me there because we are the best developers in the fight game and we take our fighters to championship levels and superstardom like we have with Canelo and Ryan Garcia. All three fights have the potential to steal the show. I guess he's talking about a boxing card here, but it's up to the fighter. You have to fight hard, you have to fight with passion, and you have to make a statement. And anybody could win at any given time. Finally, well, penultimately, he says, I'm going to stick in my lane. I'm going to work with Turki Al-Sheikh because it has been very positive. Competition in boxing is really good, but I'm going to continue to do what I do because boxing is what I love. Boxing is what made me, what helped me get here, and I'm never leaving. Turki has his plans, that's it. If Turki goes without the WBC, then that's his event. He's paying Canelo. He paid for Ring Magazine. He can do whatever he wants to do because it's their event. I'm sure Sulaiman didn't take it well, and here De La Hoya's referring to the incident, if you want to call it that, where Turki Al-Sheikh was on stage with a couple of fighters. I think it was Canelo and William Skull, and they wanted to put the WBC belt in the mix, in the photo, and Turki Al-Sheikh said no. So I think that's what De La Hoya is referring to here. Anyway, he said, I'm sure Sulaiman didn't take it well. I'm sure Sulaiman is thinking, wow, WBC, my father, been around forever. The fighters love the WBC. Sulaiman has to be a little hurt, but I'm not sure what the relationship is or how they're going to work it out. But fighters love fighting for belts. The little fighter from Rialto, California, coming up, fighting for the Continental Regional Championship, to the fighter, that means everything. That's the way I grew up. You grow up wanting to be world champion, WBC, WBA, IBF. It'll be interesting, all right? Those are the words of Oscar De La Hoya. Now, I was watching an interview with Dan Rayfield the other day, within the past couple of days. And he interviewed Dana White. And obviously, Dan Rayfield's been around a very long time. He knows a lot about boxing history. He's a veteran journalist and so on and so forth. And he shares my view with regards to this venture between Turki Al-Sheikh, the WWE guy Khan, and Dana White, in that he doesn't think this will be something that takes over boxing in the near future. Because boxing is so much bigger than MMA in terms of the number of participants. It's a much older sport. Professional boxing under Queensberry rules is like, 150 something years old? During that time, so many promoters all over the world. But if we just think about the Anglosphere, the likes of Bob Arum, Top Rank, the likes of Eddie Hearn, before him his dad, Barry Hearn, Matchroom, Frank Warren, Queensberry Promotions, Oscar De La Hoya, Golden Boy, etc., etc., Al Heyman, PBC. Okay, some of these companies go back decades and decades and decades, long before the UFC existed. They have long-standing relationships with broadcasters, and it's primarily the broadcasters that pay the money to put big fights on. I spoke in a previous live stream or a previous video about how the Saudis and back in the days, Vegas casinos used to pay site fees. But primarily the way that, promoters come up with money to put shows on and pay fighters is from the broadcasters. They front up the money and then the pay-per-view revenue comes in and they split it. right? So broadcasters know that there are many promoters out there who can deliver for them, who've got a history over decades of delivering for them. That was never the case with MMA. It's only really UFC that have this track record of being able to deliver big numbers on pay-per-view. The other MMA companies don't. This is the difference. This is why I think it's going to be much more difficult for, even with Turki Al-Sheikh's money and Dana White's expertise and his track record with the UFC and Khan with the W. Despite all that, I think it's going to be more difficult because there is a more established establishment, right? To use some funny terminology. The boxing establishment is far more established and far more powerful than the MMA establishment outside of UFC. So for them to try and put all this under one umbrella, I'm not saying it can't be done, but I think it's going to take longer than people expect, okay? And again, boxing has an enormous number of participants compared to MMA. I don't think people who watch MMA really realize this. If you go look up the number of professional MMA fighters there are in the world, folks, it's less than 2,000. Look it up. It's less than 2,000 people in the entire world who are professional MMA fighters. In boxing, it's 24,000. And that's men and women combined, by the way. Less than 2,000 in MMA. Whereas in boxing, you're talking about 24,000 active male fighters. Now, many people will argue, well, of the 24,000 active male fighters, most of them are rubbish. What, are you trying to tell me that out of 2,000 active MMA fighters, the majority of them are good? Even in the UFC, they've got about 700 fighters. That's the estimate that I've been able to find online, right? At any one time, they might have about 700 fighters. Are you trying to tell me that all 700 of those fighters are world-class MMA guys? No, they're not. It's only a small percentage of the 700 that are really world-class, okay? Therefore, the percentage of world-class boxers, or the overall number of world-class boxers that exist, is going to be much higher than the overall number of world-class MMA fighters. Oh, yes, it is, because the pool is bigger. 24,000 active male fighters. Yeah. And then you've got all the amateurs and all that type of stuff, right? So if you use the UFC model, they've distilled 2,000. If you want to be generous, because some people might argue, no, there's going to be more MMA fighters than that. Well, I've looked up on various MMA websites, and that seems to be roughly the figure. About 2,000 active professional male MMA, or male and female MMA fighters combined. Roughly 2,000. But let's be generous and say it's 3,000. Let's say the UFC have managed to distill from 3,000 fighters, the best 700 of them, and sign them up to the UFC. Even though that's not completely accurate, because Francis Ngannou was one of their best fighters and he left to go fight for the PFL. But let's just entertain that argument. From 3,000, they distilled it down to 700. Well, what number are you going to end up with when you've got 24,000 male active fighters in boxing? It's going to be a lot more than 700, isn't it? You're going to have to distill 24,000 down to what? 2,000 or 3,000 minimum? If you want to have something like, the UFC model where you've got the best talent, not just world level, but regional, domestic, so on and so forth. Because that's what they have in UFC. It's not 700 world-class MMA fighters, is it? There's a handful of world-class guys, and the rest of the guys are regional level, domestic level, so on and so forth. So you'd have to take from 24,000 active male professional boxers, you distill it down to maybe 2,000 or 3,000. That is still way bigger than UFC. Way more talent to have to preside over. Way more talent to have to sift through and match up and rank. It's a massive undertaking. It's not something that can be done, in my opinion, in my estimation, quickly. It's something that's going to take a number of years. And it may not even work. We're hearing Oscar De La Hoya showing some defiance here with regards to what Turki Al-Sheikh has said. Basically saying, look, If the reins are going to be given to Dana White to move boxing forward, then we're going to do our own thing. We're not going to play second fiddle to anyone. Now, Oscar De La Hoya has come out with bullish statements before, and some people think that those statements were aimed at Turki Al-Sheikh, and then the next thing you know, he's working with Turkey. So, De La Hoya doesn't necessarily always back up his boasts. And, of course, he sold the Ring magazine to Turki Al-Sheikh as well. But even if De La Hoya is all bark and no bite, and I'm not saying he necessarily is, but if he is, there are going to be other promoters out there who are not all bark and no bite, who will bite back. And again, I think the potential success of this boxing league for Dana White and Turki Al-Sheikh and Khan and whatnot will be contingent on paying the fighters better money, much better money than they pay them in UFC. Dana White is a miser. He's somebody that doesn't pay fighters what they're worth. His company is extremely greedy, and they don't respect the very thing that the fans are actually paying to watch, which is the fighters. They're not paying to see Dana White. They're paying to see the guys get in the ring who are literally risking their health, life, and limb, giving the fans entertainment. They are not paid in the way that they should be in the UFC, given the fact that they are the attraction. Dana White is not the flipping attraction. It's the fighters. In boxing, it is acknowledged through the business model that the fighters are the attraction. Hence, it's the inverse in terms of the split. In boxing, it's like the promoter gets 25%, the fighter gets 75%. There or thereabouts. In UFC, it's the other way around. The promoter gets 75% being the UFC, the fighters get 25 or even 20%. That's why UFC is such a massive company. I don't see that flying in boxing. I just don't see it. Because fighters for decades have seen people get, tens of millions for fights, in some cases hundreds of millions. If Dana White tries to impose the UFC economic model on boxing, well, you don't think there's going to be a load of boxers saying, what the hell's going on here? I mean, they're already trying to apparently circumvent the Ali Act or get the Ali Act removed. Right? The Ali Act not only prevents promoters also acting as a fighter's manager, but another thing that the Ali Act does is it allows fighters to be able to see the exact financial breakdown of a boxing show, to therefore make a judgment on whether they're getting screwed over for money or not. Without the Ali Act, the fighters don't get that kind of transparency. You see? And so you can understand why Dana White would want to get rid of the Ali Act. The Ali Act doesn't apply in MMA, apparently. That's why he's been able to get away with all the stuff he's been doing over there. And again, because the money in MMA is so low, it's so small compared to boxing, where else are these MMA fighters going to go? I'm not aware of any other MMA houses other than PFL when they did the deal with Ngannou, maybe a couple of other guys. For the most part, I'm not aware of any other MMA promotional companies that have a boxing style economic model where the fighters get the bulk of the money. I'm not aware of that. So who is really going to draw fighters away from UFC? You see what I'm saying? Whereas in boxing, if Dana White and Turkey try go down that road of paying fighters chicken change, do you know what I mean? Then that's going to stand the legacy promoters in good stead. You see it? Even if Turkey's got pockets as deep as the oil wells in Saudi Arabia and he's pouring all this money into this new venture with Dana White, if they're not paying the fighters more than Eddie Hearn would pay him, using the traditional model, or more than Frank Warren would pay him, or Bob Arum, or whoever, then the fighters are not going to go to that league, or at least they're not going to stay in that league. They'll go back to the traditional promoters, even an Al Heyman. This is the Achilles heel with trying to bring the UFC economic model into boxing. The competition is more fierce as far as promotional companies than it is in MMA. And we're just getting maybe a taste of things to come potentially from the likes of Oscar De La Hoya, barking a bit here. Eddie Hearn has been kind of hinting that he will fight back, but, you know, it remains to be seen whether they actually back up their boasts.